I don't know what that is. Is it a friendship bracelet? I'm going to go with that. And it has on it, yep, David and Jonathan vowed to be friends forever and to always honor each other's family. And then it has a picture of them and their memory verse. Do not be afraid, your prayer has been heard. All right, so that's what our kiddos were studying. Friendship. All right. Jesus was making a lot of acquaintances, not necessarily friends, right? But a lot of acquaintances. So today, as you all talked about in your groups, we're going to talk about authority. The fact that Jesus had authority over all of creation. But authority, the word itself, a despised word by some, an honored word by others. But what does the word authority actually mean? The Greek, which I realized I didn't go in to listen to how you say it in Greek, so this is my interpretation. Exousia, from exesti. Means it is permissible, allowed, it is lawful. That's the Greek. And the translation of that is the right to control or command. And the key word there is the right to control or command. Then Webster's talks about the power to influence or command thought, opinion, or behavior. And the number 2 meaning is persons in command. So we're living in a nation with groups of people who want to remove authorities, such as those who want to defund the police. There has never been a shortage of those who refuse to submit to the authority that has been placed over them. But the authority figures in our lives are usually there for our safety and well-being. Every child is brought into the world through a mother and father who are, by their very design, there to protect and nurture that child into adulthood. But many start resisting authority at a very young age. If not reined in through discipline, it only gets worse as a child grows and matures, and that resistance may eventually turn into full-blown rebellion. I like this picture. That's what authority or the lack of it can look like at home. But what is Matthew talking about when he refers to Jesus' authority? And how are we shown what it looks like to submit to authority? That's what authority or the lack of it can look like. But when we last left off in our text, Matthew had just told us that Jesus was teaching as one having authority and not like the scribes. The scribes who taught and interpreted the law were focused only on the law and themselves. Jesus, in contrast, was focused on the Father and his will. So this authority definition, if we look at that again, does our definition fit with Jesus' manner of teaching? According to the Greek meaning, he definitely had the authority from God to command, and he was definitely using his power to influence his followers as he was trying to instruct to change their thought, opinions, and behaviors to a more righteous way of life. So what we are about to see is that Jesus indeed has true authority over all of creation. He is the sum of Webster's definition number 2. He is the person in full command of everything. As we look at chapter 8, we'll see how Jesus would demonstrate his power and authority over the human body, over the elements of nature, and over the spiritual realm. And then in addition, in chapter 9 next week, we're going to see his authority over sin. So now please keep in mind, as you went through today and looked at these events in chapter 8 in your group time, that the events in chapter 8 and 9 are not in chronological order, just a reminder of that, but rather grouped by types of events. Some possibly may have even occurred before the Sermon on the Mount and some after, because other Gospels do share these events in a different order. So remember, Matthew wasn't concerned about order, so some people see that as a contradiction. It's just the way Matthew chose to share the events. So it doesn't really matter the order. What matters is it happened. And they do all share different events. All the Gospels, that is. Okay, so first, we're told that Jesus came down off the mountain. We were told that he went up the mountain. Now he came down off the mountain. Apparently, Matthew, documenting this, tells the reader that teaching time for now is over. Jesus was off to show tangible evidence of the authority that his followers had heard. Now they were going to see it. Jesus first shows his authority over the human body, and he did not heal just anyone, but the recording of his first specific healings were to those considered by the Jews to be outcasts. He heals a leper, he heals a Gentile, and then he heals a woman. So Jesus heals the leper. Chapter 8 begins with a brief encounter of a leper coming directly to Jesus and requesting healing from his leprosy. He didn't just ask, but his stance of bowing down before Jesus showed honor and submission to Jesus' authority. He didn't demand, but humbly asked that if Jesus was willing, the leper knew he could heal him. Jesus' immediate response of reaching out to touch the untouchable shows that he could see the sincerity and humility in the leper's desire to be healed. As a result of his submission and his faith, Jesus had compassion on him and healed him. And he didn't just heal, Jesus touched him, which would have spoken volumes to those in the crowd observing. As we learned from our workbook questions when we looked in Leviticus, no one was to touch a leper, or they would be considered unclean as well. We know Jesus could have just left it at speaking the healing, right? He's done that before, but he went further and touched the man. He purposely touched him. Jesus then instructs the leper to follow the law by showing himself to the priest in order to be restored to the community. However, Mark tells his readers the healed leper didn't exactly follow that request, but told everyone he saw what Jesus had done. Thus, Jesus' popularity and his abilities and his authority over illnesses grew. So next we look at the Roman centurion. Next, Matthew tells us that Jesus entered Capernaum. If you'll recall, Capernaum was in Galilee in the northern region and was occupied by many Gentiles and was Roman ruled. Matthew then shares with us the event of the Roman centurion, who was an officer over 100 men, actually coming to Jesus to request healing for his servant. Every centurion mentioned in the Gospels and in Acts was a man of high character with a great sense of duty. And this man was no exception. His concern for his servant was evidence of this. This centurion had also apparently become a man of great faith. What Jesus had been doing in the Galilee region had surely not gone unnoticed by the Roman soldiers. Anytime a large crowd gathered could have meant many things to the Roman cohort, and not the least being a possible threat to the Roman occupation itself, since they knew the Jews weren't that thrilled with them. So this centurion would have been well aware of the peaceful gatherings and miracles that Jesus had been performing. His understanding of authority caused Jesus to marvel. Only twice in the Gospels was it recorded that Jesus marveled. And it's interesting that it's here. He marveled at someone's great belief. And then in Mark 6:6, he marveled at the great unbelief of the Jews. So it's interesting that each marvel was total opposite ends that he marveled at. The religious leaders and many of his fellow Jews certainly were not impressed with Jesus' authority. So seeing one who was a Gentile military leader with authority in the region as well as his great faith, willing to submit to Jesus' authority and acknowledge the power he possessed, truly amazed Jesus. Jesus would heal another Gentile from a distance, also due to great faith, which we'll read about in chapter 15. Stay tuned. Next, Matthew gives us the final physical healing event in this passage with Jesus healing Peter's mother-in-law. This is a very brief event, or recording of it. But according to Mark 1:29, Jesus and his disciples had just left the synagogue and entered the house of Simon Peter and Andrew, with James and John also in attendance. Jesus was informed of her illness. He immediately touched her again, touched her hand, and she was healed. Once again, with compassion, he chose to touch her, after which the fever dissipated. Then she got up and served them all, as any good mother does. By evening, word had gotten out that Jesus was over at Peter's house. As a result, Mark states that the whole city showed up at the door, bringing for healing those who were ill and others who were demon-possessed. And we are told that Jesus healed them all from whatever was afflicting them. Interestingly, Mark records that in this instance, at least with everybody coming to Peter's house, Jesus would not permit the demons to speak because they knew him. But later on, we'll see where they do speak. Next, Matthew states that because of the crowds, Jesus wanted to cross over to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. But first, Jesus had an interaction with a couple of men who seemed to have higher priorities than following Jesus. They said they wanted to follow him, but were still preoccupied with the things of the world. They both state a lofty goal, but Jesus kind of shoots holes in their good intentions. Let's face it, at this point, with all the traveling Jesus was doing, both he and the apostles were virtually homeless. While they were traveling, at least here they were at Peter's house, but most of the time they're on the road. They have no place to stay. So the scribe who purported his willingness to follow him anywhere possibly didn't realize what he was actually committing to. So Jesus reminded him. And the one who wanted to bury Dad first, it's possible Dad wasn't anywhere near his deathbed. So basically what this man was saying was, let me live life first, and then I'll follow. Jesus' statement of letting the dead bury their own dead was calling him out on his priorities. Forsaking all and submitting fully to Jesus has a cost. After this interaction, Jesus and his disciples did get into the boat to cross over the sea to get a break from the crowds. Storms are common on the Sea of Galilee. It's 13 miles long and 8 miles wide, so a rather large body of water. So it is probable that Jesus commanded them to head out to sea knowing that a storm would be coming and that he was going to use it to test their faith. At this point, Jesus had been pretty much going nonstop, so he needs to rest and falls asleep. A huge storm does rise, and fear spreads quickly amongst the disciples as they're just sure they're all going to die. So they wake Jesus up, and he first admonishes them for their weak faith. It seems that their lack of faith is being compared to each event Matthew had just written about that showed the amazing faith of the centurion as well as the faith of the leper. All these men had witnessed these incredible examples of these men's faith and many miracles of healing that Jesus had been performing, but they still didn't have enough faith to believe that Jesus could help them in their time of need. So Jesus gets up and calms the sea. This action alone amazes the disciples that even nature is under Jesus' authority. This was further evidence to the disciples of Jesus' apparent authority over not just physical ailments and even demons, but even over the created world and nature itself. Their next recorded statement of what sort of man is this that even winds and sea obey him shows that they still did not fully understand who Jesus is. So our last story in Matthew 8 describes Jesus' interaction with demons, who know perfectly well who he is, and even answered the disciples' question of who is this man when they call him Son of God. At this event, Jesus does allow the demons to speak, possibly because it's just Jesus and his disciples with no crowds around, but also because they identify him as the Son of God within the hearing of the disciples. Warren Wiersbe has a great summary of this event as shown here. He breaks this down into 3 different sections. So he says this dramatic event is most revealing. It shows what Satan does for a man. He robs him of his sanity and self-control. He fills him with fears. Satan robs him of the joys of home and friends, and if possible, condemns him to an eternity of judgment. That's what Satan has to offer. It also reveals what society does for a man in need. Society restrains him, isolates him, threatens him, but society is unable to change him. So then, what Jesus Christ can do for a man whose whole life, within and without, is in bondage and battle, Jesus came to them, they respond, and then he restores mankind to a life of sanity, society, and service. Even though an entire herd of pigs were destroyed, 2 men's lives were saved. And because they had been so violent that no one could pass by the road where they were, peace had now been restored to the community, as the demons within these men were no longer a threat. So even though this community came against Jesus, he had actually done them a huge favor in that they were now able to use this road that they had been unable to pass on because the men were now living in peace. Restoration of their souls. So what are our takeaways from today? First, number 1, Jesus has authority over all of creation. That's the first thing. But Jesus also showed us an example of what it looks like to show compassion. You notice before he did any miracles at all, before he did any healing, whether it was physical, whether it was demonic, or whether it was over nature, having authority over that it often said that his compassion came out first. Granted, we may not leave here running around healing people, but compassion is definitely something we can have for those who need it. We are called on to be following in Jesus' example, and that is showing compassion to all. So that's our first lesson learned from today, is following his example of showing compassion. Next, it's submitting to Jesus Christ's authority, which brings freedom, healing, and peace. These are, you may ask, we understand healing and we understand the peace that these people felt, but what is the freedom about? Freedom is being set free from what was keeping them down, what was keeping them in bondage. That could have been a physical ailment, it could have been a demonic, and it could be sin. And we're going to talk about that more next week, how Jesus had the authority even over sin. In this chapter, we were shown that he had the authority over the physical, over the spiritual realm, and over nature itself. But next week, we're going to go a little deeper with sin into the miracles that he performed and that he did in the society around him, to those who had the faith to believe. So how do we submit? We submit by having the faith to trust and obey Jesus. He calls us to something higher than ourselves. He calls us to being a people of compassion. He calls us to coming to him and seeking out healing for whatever it may be that we struggle with. He calls us to something else, something more than ourselves. But as we're shown throughout this chapter, all of these people had faith, except apparently the disciples in the midst of a storm on the sea. They all had the faith. He said he didn't say they didn't have faith, because at least they knew he could do something about it. But their fear showed that their faith was little. They had little faith. And that's what Jesus called it, little faith. Oh, you of little faith. So first we have to have faith. We have to have faith in believing that Jesus can actually do something in our lives, that he can actually make a change, that he can make a difference in everyday life. Do we have the faith to do that? Are we willing to submit our entire life to Jesus Christ's authority, not just pieces of it, not just portions of it? Are we able to remember what God has done for us? How Jesus' sheer existence in our lives, we can see a difference? Do we remember that? Do we have markers in our life we can go back to? So your challenge for the week is just that. Are you willing to submit your entire life to Jesus Christ's authority? And what does that look like for you? That could be a little different for everybody in this room. You may have areas of your life you've submitted to him, and other areas you haven't. So only you can answer that question. Only you can go before Jesus and say, Lord, what haven't I given to you? What haven't I submitted to your authority? Show me what that is. So that's your challenge of the week. We are going to sing a song called Trust and Obey, an oldie but a goodie. I've got 2 verses of it up here, and we've got time, so we're going to sing both of them. We're just going to sing it a cappella. So if you'll stand with me, we're going to close with singing Trust and Obey. When we walk with the Lord in the light of his word, what a glory he sheds on our way. While we do his good will, he abides with us still, and with all who will trust and obey. Trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus, but to trust and obey. Then in fellowship sweet, we will sit at his feet, or will walk by his side in the way. What he says we will do, where he sends we will go. Never fear, only trust and obey. Trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus, but to trust and obey. Father, that is our desire, to have the faith, enough faith that we can trust you, that we can trust you to the extent of obeying you in all things. Father, those 3 words, faith, trust, obedience. You have control over everything in this world anyway. Lord, help us to have enough faith to trust you in every little area of our lives, that we can come to you before we make any decision, so that we can be obedient to you, that we can be submissive to your will in our own lives, in each of our lives. Father, help us to have faith so that we can trust and obey. This next week is yours, Lord. Every moment of every day is yours. So we give it to you and our lives as well, Lord. Help us to submit our entire beings to you this week. We pray this in your Son's name. Amen. Have a good week.